Welcome, everybody. This is the end of year community meeting for OpenFGA. So time flies. Can you believe it's the end already of 2025? When we'll start planning next year, and then we'll be in the end of next year very quickly as usual. And everything we wanted to ship in a year will take us 2 years as usual, right? So anyway, and then I can need to see. Okay, perfect. Next thing. So this is the usual agenda. Intros for the people who are new to the call. We welcome them to introduce themselves, and then things we shipped, some demos, or we are going to have Sarah today presenting what they have been doing with FGA in the open lane and what should we doing, what are we doing next, some community news and Q&A. So this is the FGA team. I hope you know me. I've been leading moderating these meetings for a while. I'm Andres. I'm the product lead for FGA. I'm based in Uruguay in South America, and I'm now in San Francisco. And if someone else wants to introduce themselves, please go ahead. In particular, if you've never been in these meetings, and we'd love to know more about you.
Sure, I can go. I'm new to the meeting. We are, well, my name is Phil, and I'm from Edmonton, Alberta, Canada. Work for a group called Media. We're building education software and starting to use OpenFGA in our SaaS product. So,
Cool. Thank you, Peter, for that. Anyone else? Okay, good. So you might have heard, but we are going to repeat it again. And so OpenFGA is now part of CNCF Incubation, and that we were approved a month ago. And of course, we are very happy about it. We had a lot of help from members of the community who accepted to be interviewed by them. If you go to the links that are there, you can read their use cases and how they're using OpenFGA. They are very interesting use cases, all of them quite different. And so we believe this is kind of a new start for us. It's going to give us more opportunities to engage with larger companies and do work better as a community. So we are very, very excited about next year and how this is going to help the project moving forward. So we didn't ship a lot last month. We fixed the security thing. You can get details there in the release notes. It was kind of an edge case with a kind of odd model construct. We never didn't have anyone in our SaaS products that had that kind of modeling, so we don't expect that to be significant. But you can read more details about it if you need it. And we shipped the Helm chart with those two new versions, and we are adding small improvements on the SDKs. The biggest one is we hadn't had BatchCheck support in .NET for a while. I think BatchCheck we shipped, I don't know, months ago, and now all SDKs have it. And then in Java and Python, when we were throwing an exception, the message wasn't clearly displayed in the stack trace and in the exception that was thrown. So we fixed that so you can easily now know what is the error, what caused the exception. So small fixes. We are going to keep working on small fixes there and keep SDKs improving all the time. And Anurag is working on that. So thank you, Anurag, for all your help with SDKs. Okay, so this is OpenFGA in action. Last month we had Jeremy presenting about what they're doing in Headspace, and today we're going to have Sarah sharing how they're using OpenFGA in the open lane. So thanks, Sarah, for joining us. I'll stop sharing and let you continue.
Awesome. So I'm Sarah Funkhauser. I'm one of the co-founders of a company called Openlane, and I run our engineering team. And we have been using OpenFGA kind of prior to Openlane being founded about a year ago, have continued to use it at Openlane since. And I'll kind of talk about like the problems we run into, why we wanted authorization from the ground from the start. Not all startups necessarily start with fine-grained permissions, and like why that was so important to us, and kind of how our tech stack relates to kind of the open source features that we've built. So kind of just give you an overview, I'll talk about what Openlane is, why we chose Openlane. I know everyone, or why we chose OpenFGA. I know everyone here is passionate about OpenFGA, but I like to kind of talk about like what made it what we wanted to choose for our product, the architecture that we're using, and how we're using ENT, which is another open source tool for Go. It's an ORM, and how that integrates with our OpenFGA model and how we create tuples via that, as well as issues and kind of how we fix those things along the way. So just like a brief, what is Openlane? We are an open source compliance automation tool. So if companies are going through their SOC 2, their ISO, kind of all of that, those like audit processes that at this point in time, almost every SaaS company has to be compliant in some sort of way with one of these frameworks. We support kind of a wide variety of frameworks and help our typical customers, like an early stage startup, going through their first SOC 2, but we've also worked with customers that have existing SOC 2s and they just want a more open, transparent platform, so they're coming to us and switching from some of our competitors. So why OpenFGA, and why did we want fine-grained permissions? Being a tool in the security space really meant that like we needed to exhibit kind of what behaviors we expect from other tooling in our product. And so we couldn't just have like your basic read, write kind of role set of permissions, because there's a lot of things within what a compliance program offers that you don't want everyone to have access to, or you want your auditor to be able to see certain things that you don't want. You don't want them to see everything in your organization, as well as different kind of roles within an organization will have different roles within a compliance program. So engineers a lot of times might upload evidence, but they don't necessarily need to have edit access to controls. And so being able to define that in like a fine-grained permission was kind of critical to our platform being successful. And we didn't want to bolt it on later. I've done that at previous companies and it just doesn't work well. And if we're greenfielding a product, we should start with it from the beginning. I probably evaluated 10 different tools when we first did this, both open source and SaaS products. And I ended up on OpenFGA, one, because I felt like open source was kind of critical to our tool. When I think of an open source project that I like fully see as open source, you can run it without paying kind of these SaaS subscriptions to actually get it off the ground. And so it being open source was kind of critical to that kind of standard of what we wanted our tool and what it meant to be open source for us. Also at the time, it was one of the only ones out there with a playground. And I'm a very visual learner of like, how am I creating this model and how, like, why is it not working how I want? And so that was very critical in at least my first couple of months of like developing our model and how it worked and making sure like I'm actually kind of seeing like the passes and failures and writing the tests with it. And so that was like the number one kind of thing that swung me over the edge of some of the other ones out there that didn't have it at the time. So our kind of tech stack on the back end is all Go. And so like the ability to kind of read the code in OpenFGA was really kind of useful for us to like understand how it worked. And it integrated very easily into kind of like how we were setting things up. We have a GraphQL API, and that in itself kind of gives you other issues that you don't think about if you have a regular REST API. And I'll get into like what those kind of gotchas are towards the end and how that kind of influenced kind of how we develop some of the wrappers that we have. As I mentioned before, we use the ENT ORM framework. And if you go to the website, if you haven't used ENT before, it says it's an ORM. It's way more than that. Like you basically write your schema and it generates everything from all of those type definitions all the way out to the graph resolver. So we have ENT in combination with ENT GQL and GQLGen that basically does all of that generation. And then we've added our own kind of code generation in there, including some of like the FGA checks and like tuple creation so that we're not rewriting all of this stuff and we can kind of scale quickly with such a small team. And then obviously we use OpenFGA for authorization. So one of the first questions that came to me when I was like, we need to implement this is where do we actually implement these checks? There's kind of like three like kind of things that you think of when you go to implement this in a GraphQL API. And I have an article at the end that I read when I first did this. It's an article by ASA, which is another authorization service, but SaaS tool, and they did a really good job of explaining like the different places you would do it. And resolvers are like your REST, same thing as your REST handlers. If you put it in there, then you're duplicating all of these checks. And because graph kind of, you can enter in a resolver, but then get data from other kind of objects, it doesn't work well. You have a lot of duplicated code. You're kind of manually writing this all out. Just isn't really a good implementation. The next kind of obvious choice is directives. And this is something like built into GraphQL. It works really well for like if it's something simple and repetitive. So like admin role is kind of like your role-based implementation of permissions works well, doesn't really kind of scale well, and there's a lot of opportunity for human error. So if you don't add that annotation, you could expose a bunch of data you don't want to. So the kind of final choice and what we ended up going with was the data access level. This means that on every schema, you're defining who has permissions to do what kind of thing for that specific object. And those will always be, it'll always go through that no matter kind of how you're getting that data, which is really important for that kind of GraphQL architecture. Just quickly, if you're not familiar with ENT, some terminology that I'll kind of reference as we go through. The first kind of two are hooks and interceptors. These are basically your middleware. Hooks are applied on any mutation. So in your typical REST scenario, this is your put, post, delete. And then interceptors are done on any queries. And it's important to know that just because you're doing a update, you still have a query to return the data. So everything kind of has like that double check on a mutation because you're entering the data and then you're retrieving it back to give to the user. And that might be like different data than what was actually on the update. And then we have policies, and this is like the kind of critical piece of how we implemented our OpenFGA authorization layer. And then mixins, which just basically allow the reuse of code across schemas. And so we'll kind of dig into how that helped us kind of speed up and not duplicate a lot of this code. So just kind of a brief visual. You have your ENT schema, you generate a bunch of code, and then when a request comes in, you have your hooks, interceptors, and policies. Your hooks are where you are creating those tuples in OpenFGA. So depending on like what the schema and what the model needs based on kind of what you define as those hooks, it's going to create those tuples. Your interceptors and policies are what is going to actually check that you have access to that data. We originally started off with just using policies and ran into kind of issues with if you're requesting kind of, I want all of this one object, you then have to list objects and end up with really slow queries that I'll come to in a bit. So we ended up kind of this combination of both like a policy to do like base level checks of, can you even do this at all? And then interceptors actually filter out the data. And then all of the mutation authorization is based on the policies within the schemas. So what are policies and how do they work? Policies can be applied to mutations, to queries. They can be applied to like specific operations. So they might just be on create. They might just be on update. And they can be at the schema level or applied to all requests, which are called runtime hooks or runtime policies. And so we have in our data model, we have both a pre-policy, these are applied to everything, before any other schema policies are checked. And then we have a post policy, and these are done after any other kind of schema level policies are checked. So a request comes in, we'll say it's a query at this point, and we have, if it's an internal request, which means it's a query that's happening within the server as part of a request from a customer. If it has this context on it, just allow it to go through. And this is because, as I said, if we have it on the schema level, they're checked within requests, no matter how that data is being queried from the database. So sometimes the user doesn't actually have access to that data at that point. And so we need to allow the request to go through to actually like determine if they should have access. And then it would go to the schema checks. And then the default policy on all schemas is to allow, which basically means that like, at this point, we know the user is authorized into our system. We want to allow the request to go through. They haven't been denied for anything specific. And we're going to apply our interceptors later. Mutations are very similar, where again, if we have an internal request, we might want it to go through automatically. We have we've implemented all of our like module feature-based restrictions on the schema level as well, which means that like it's checking to see if you have that feature, and it's going to explicitly deny if you don't, otherwise it's continue on. And then kind of the opposite mutations are denied by default. So if you don't have access, it's going to say you haven't passed any of these checks. We're gonna send you an error that says you can't do this. And so on a specific kind of schema, we're taking controls as an example. You kind of have your base level rules of like, if you're a system admin, meaning you're an employee at OpenLane, you have access to kind of add this data because we have system kind of level data that we're seeding via our API. Again, if you have this allow context, it can also go through. And then we kind of have these wrappers around what are actually OpenFGA checks. So we have a lot of things that are permission hierarchy. So if you have admin access to a program within OpenLane, you might inherit access to create a whole bunch of objects or edit access to those objects that is the parent of. And so we're saying, can you create objects under this parent? And then you have, can you just generically create this type of object? Can you create controls? And that is both checking an organization level, can you just generally create objects in the organization, as well as we have the ability to like just give particular groups access to create objects so that you can have access to only create controls in the system because that's kind of your role within the organization, but you can't go create policies or procedures. And then finally, we have a package called NFGA that generates your basic, can a user update this object or this like set of objects? And so all of these are generated code that if you add the policy to the schema, it's the last kind of, if it's an update operation, it's going to go check that user has that tuple in FGA that says I can actually edit this object. And so that kind of works is like, whenever we use ent, you have multiple kind of paths of generation. You're first going to generate the actual fields of the schema, and then we add this indication. It can be self-access checks, which means that you're checking this object specifically. It could be you're checking another object. So groups are a good example of this, where you're not, group membership isn't actually an object in our FGA model. The group is, and so you have to have edit access to that group. And this will kind of generate the code that'll say like how you do that check. And then on the policies, you're adding kind of, do you have edit access? Do you have delete access to that object? And this is again, all on the schema itself. And so one of the things that we were trying to solve is like, I don't want to like necessarily give permission to a user to all of these individual objects. I want, if they're an admin of this program, I want them to be able to have edit access to every kind of object under it because they are administering this program. Or I want to give them edit access to the control and anything that kind of falls underneath of it. And so we implemented this. It's a mix-in that we add to probably almost every schema at this point that says, this is an object-owned schema. And that means that I can say it's owned by the organization, which means you have to be in the organization to kind of see that object. But we can also kind of granularly give access on like a program or a group-based level to inherit those permissions down so that you can kind of choose a parent object to give permissions and it kind of cascades below. And as I said, we use the hooks to actually create the tuples. So the request comes in, you create the data in the database, and then it creates the kind of tuples as the user who owns it, the parent objects, and then it removes any kind of tuples that were removed. I'm going to kind of quickly go through the flows. Kind of all of them are pretty basic of like how you would get data out. You have your get request, you're kind of checking an ID and you're returning if you have access to that object or not, and then returning the data via GraphQL. That's really like your easy case. You already have the tuples in there, you're kind of getting back the data. Again, update is very similar. It's like your pretty straightforward use case. You're saying, do you have edit access to this object? How are those done? And those policies are kind of checked as you go. Kind of the more complex stuff is like, if I create an object, those tuples have to be added to OpenFGA. And so it's saying, can you create this object? Checking OpenFGA for that create access. Yes, you can. And then I need to add and remove tuples based on that request that says, who else has permission to these objects, kind of based on the hooks that are defined in those schemas, and then it returns that data. And then the fun one, I'm sure we've all had fun with being able to list lots of objects and like how you get that data. This was fun for us because I originally set it up with list objects. And local testing, it was great, like everything worked. I did the call to FGA, got all the objects that I had access to, added those to my query filter, and then can return them. Except when I had lots more objects and a much more complicated model, that significantly slowed down. I think at one point, our query to like actually get control out of the database took 8 seconds, which is like not useful for a customer in a UI. They're like trying to load a table and it takes like 10 seconds to load. It just didn't work. So we kind of flipped it around. And I have a blog post I linked at the end of like kind of what we did for this, but instead of listing the objects and then querying our database, we have the interceptor that says, I know what organizations this user has access to. So we add that to our query first. And then once we get like this initial set of objects, we then say, of these IDs, what does this particular user actually have access to? And we send batch checks to OpenFGA. Those are returned. And then we only return the ones that the user had access to, which also worked great until you were a user that didn't have access to everything. And so you're saying, I want 10 objects back. And so the query, we go to the database, it's limited to 10. It gives me, I check to see which ones the user has access to. Maybe they only have access to 3 of this set of 10. So we return 3, but we say, oh, but you have 57 other objects, and here's the cursor to the next one. And the user's like, but why do I only get 3 when I ask for 10? So we ended up kind of, depending on the object and kind of how scattered those permissions are in the database, we overfetch the data from the database. And so we're querying the database, we get all of the ones for the organization back. We say, well, they requested 10, let's actually pull 100 from the database to start. And then we're gonna say, which ones of these do the user have access to? Once we get ones that they have access to, we'll return the first 10 and set our cursor for the pagination to that last one we actually return, and then return the data. And so this is kind of how we worked around the fact that like we can't use list objects with large amount of data. We use it for like a couple like smaller kind of sets of data, but in that particular case, it just like wasn't scalable for kind of how our model and data set worked. And then the other big gotcha we had was edges within GraphQL. So when you are, let's say you're creating I think I have an example on the next slide. You're updating a control and you're saying, I want to link this procedure to the control. And there was times where I was like testing across organizations and I had an ID and I tried to update it and my request it passed, but when I got the result back, I wasn't getting that edge to that procedure. It turns out that because I was cross organizations, that was a valid ID for a procedure, but I didn't have actually access to it. So the schema level like policies allowed me, so I didn't actually get the procedure back, but it looked like, if you looked at the database, that there was an edge to this data. And so we had to implement, which I have a package called access checks, which basically says, what permissions do I need to actually access this edge and link it to this other object? So in this case, do I need either read or write access to that procedure to link it to my control? And so what we have is, by default, everything to link to each other, you need edit access. Now, this isn't always true. If you are creating a task and you say this task is related to control, I don't need to actually have edit access to the control. I just need to be able to see it. And so you can override that on the schema level when you define the edge. It says, I need access to this, but I just need view access to this. Or maybe I need edit access, but to a different object. And so these annotations allow us to programmatically say, like when we're defining the schema, what you actually need access to add this edge, and so that it's successful, but also you can get the data back later and you don't have these like weird orphaned kind of data in your database. And you can also like completely skip these checks. This is kind of a less common use case, but if it's something is already implemented by a like privacy protection from a parent, we don't actually need that extra query to the database to see, or that query to OpenFGA to return that. And so it allows us to kind of fix the problem where it can be arbitrary what data you're creating and updating with a GraphQL schema. And then those are just kind of functions that allow us to add it to every kind of schema, and they run through and they say, can I edit this, or can I add this edge, or can I remove this edge, and uses kind of like the pattern matching of how those edges are defined in NET to give you that data. And then finally, like I hinted at this beginning, we also use FGA for our feature flags. All of our pricing in our system is module based. So it's not like, do you have access to the system or not? It's what modules are you paying for, and which kind of schemas does that relate to? And to be able to scale this across multiple schemas, again, we have like our OpenFGA definition that says, is this organization, is this feature enabled for them? And then on the schemas themselves, we define which modules that schema requires. So if it's a control, it requires the compliance schema. If it's part of like the trust center custom domain, you need the trust center module. And it can be multiple ones. So you only need like, if it was a schema for multiple modules, you just need one of those in your organization. And then it's like, it's a runtime interceptor. So every request that comes in, it says, which objects am I querying, or which objects am I creating, and allows or denies that at the first part of the schema, so that you don't have to kind of get all the data back and then realize that that user doesn't actually have access to it. Any questions? I don't know, it's kind of a lot.
Can you go back to the previous slide? I have a question there.
Yeah.
So here, if you want, so let's say you want, I don't know, list some kind of resources, right? That depend on having a feature enabled. Do you do first one checking an interceptor saying, can this user even use this feature? And then another one is, can actually view the resource? So is there more than one check executed?
Yes.
Okay.
So the actual feature check happens, it's not on the schema level. Well, it's saying that like when the request comes in, which modules does the user have and which modules does this query require? So it's just checking if the feature is enabled and if they have enough features. And then any kind of query to the database or mutation to the database is going through the schema level checks that says, do I have access to this particular object itself?
Makes sense.
This has been a lovely presentation, to be honest, especially when it comes to Excel, because we've struggled to share such knowledge because we don't use it internally. So it's lovely to see it here. I'm wondering specifically around the annotations you have, and I feel like in the long term, as in it would be nice to bring this kind of annotations and definitions into our schema, so you don't have to write it in different places. And it's not possible right now, but we have like many requests and many talks and ideas with customers. I know like from Docker, like they have the same request around if we can add more annotations to the schema. And I wonder if we can collaborate on a just ideation, not the actual implementation of what this might look like. Because it would be amazing if you don't have to write all this extra code. You can just get this all from the model itself.
Yeah, I think in our case, like because we were using an ORM that kind of generated all this, it was the most logical place for us to put it was like, it needs to be on the schema. We need to understand like how those work together, but we've probably rewritten this code many times and like it's way better than it was like a year ago. It's more like there's stuff that we generate today we don't even use because it doesn't actually, like we ended up with multiple requests. Like we ended up because everything goes through the schema level, that means that like every time I'm like going to do something, it's requesting that same thing again. And so kind of balancing the fact that like it needs to be on the schema level, but like I don't want to keep calling FGA. Although the caching, I think that was implemented like middle of this year, that helped a ton with like what we actually end up hitting on the database. But yeah, I think the schema level is like where it needs to be defined for it to work well.
Jeremy has a great question in the chat. He's asking, like, are you using OpenFGA as a library for this, or is it deployed as a service? And are you using the same database for both or not?
So we have deployed FGA as a service. So we run everything in Kubernetes. So OpenFGA is running as a service alongside our main API, so the requests go through. Both our FGA and main database are Postgres, but they're in separate databases so that as we scale, we can kind of scale those databases independently. And then we're using the Go SDK for all of it. We have wrappers around it to make some of it easier and more consistent. And so I have a slide here, and I can distribute this after. I don't know how you guys usually do that, but the IAM repo, we have our FGAX wrapper, which is really just like sitting on top of the Go SDK to like kind of make sure that we're consistently doing the same thing, and we can wrap around like how we do batch checks or how we like iterate over like what we're pulling back. And then we have an FGA wrapper, which is how we're integrating Ent and FGA and kind of that generated code. And then we have another library called Access Map, which is how we're kind of doing those edge definition checks. Does that answer the question? Yeah.
Yeah, thank you.
Will do.
I'm not on camera or talking much because I'm chasing a 1-year-old dog around, but thank you.
Yeah, no problem.
And Sarah, please feel free to share the slides of blog posts in the OpenFGA CNCF channel. I'm sure everyone would find it super interesting.
Will do.
So I did have one more question. So I'm dealing with the pagination problem right now I have thousands and thousands of records. So the overfetching idea is actually pretty good. How do you enforce, like, there's X kind of page limits, or do you just kind of leave it open-ended? So for example, like maybe there's 400 pages of results. You're only authorized to see maybe 37 of them, but I can't just query overfetch, let's say 3,700 records. What's your kind of approach for that?
So we enforce that you can't pull more than 100 records at a time. So all requests have to be paginated up to that. So like the most I think we pull to overfetch is like 1,000 records for 100 requests. And so that makes it so that we're not pulling everything all the time. We're requiring like the user of the API to actually paginate through those results.
Okay. No, that's probably a good restriction because I know the server side limits are kind of set for 100 per batch checks. Okay.
Yeah.
Appreciate
and
that.
I don't think there's actually a real use case for someone to actually fetch 40,000 records at once. They can figure out how to paginate. Like we make it so it's easy to paginate through it.
Yeah. Okay, perfect.
Yeah, I think two challenges there. So what is hard is if you want to show the number of pages that you have, of course, that's challenging because it's hard to know how many records can you actually see, right? So you need to resort to a pagination method that doesn't show you have 10 pages, right? Because you do know, yeah?
We do. Well, we say how many total records you have access to. And so that's actually a different query than like what's returning all of the results. So we actually do say, we have a query that says that if someone puts like a total count query on their GraphQL request, it has to say, pull all of the stuff from the database. You're no longer overfetching. You're saying, pull everything they have access to, and then doing batch checks to OpenFGA. So that is more expensive for that to happen because it's another request on top of the actual data request.
Yep. Yeah, makes sense. And then the other one is the thing about pagination and the number of records, right? So if you want to sort and filter your request, you cannot do it you cannot ask FGA, give me a page of list objects, right? And then get that page, and then you do filtering and sorting, because of course those records that we return in the first page of list objects are not going to be sorted and are not going to be filtered by your filters. So so if you want to do something like I want to run a full query, right, on my database that can only have the records that I need to get them all. Okay, like maybe I need to get 4K in a single call to list objects if that worked, right? And then put that in an in clause so I can then sort and filter. That is today is list objects are getting better, but I I don't know if we'll be able to get 40K or 50K documents fast enough, right? So
Yeah.
depending on your use case, you might go with list objects as it gets better and get the full list, maybe 2,000, 5,000, 10,000 that works, right? And if not, this pagination approach makes more sense, right? So yeah.
I would try
Yep.
that.
Yeah. No, I appreciate that. Thank you.
For the server side.
Another comment about that is what we see, and I think that Grafana's team did something like that, which is sometimes you can filter on a higher level records in the hierarchy. For example, and if you have folders and dashboards, right? If you want to do like a list objects on the dashboards, there are too many and you cannot get them all. Now, doing list objects in folders, that might work because it's not a lot of folders that you have access to, right? So you say, okay, give me all the folders and then give me all the documents in these folders. And then it's highly likely that if you can see the folder, you can see the document, right? So it's very easy then to fill a page. So
Yep.
that idea of in which level to use list objects can also be an approach to address the issue.
Yeah, we use list objects on like the organization because you're only going to have access to like a max a handful, and like groups and stuff. We do list objects because there's
Yep.
also not a ton of those.
Makes sense. George.
Yeah, hi. I was actually, I was going to add the sort of question regarding sorting there. I mean, it's one of the issues that I've been kind of having is related to sort of complex sorts, and and I don't really know what the best way to handle that is. And I wanted to also add something about the total count. How do you guys kind of handle that? Because, I guess if you overfetch, you probably don't want to show that that's the total records, because they might not actually be able to see those records. So you would have to, overfetch and do batch checks, or fetch everything and then also do list objects and then sort of see the totals between all of this. There's a lot of like, kind of sewing of the results, which is sort of a challenge. So I don't know how you guys can sort of work for that and solve that.
Yeah, so when a total count and the actual results you're getting back are two different kind of processes that go through in the middleware for GraphQL. So the actual data that is being returned, that's what we overfetch. When we're getting the total count, we say, give me all the objects, give me all the IDs of the objects that this organization has access to, and then we batch check all of those. So like we're sending out, like we fan out a ton of requests at once to get the total count so that that's accurate for what that user can see. And again, it's like the more kind of disparate those records are, the harder this problem becomes. And so like it's something that we're probably going to have to like look back at again later, because I think like something that like is very like the user doesn't have a ton of access to, overfetching, you still need to possibly overfetch more or just make a secondary kind of request to get that data to get more.
Yeah, I would say that if you have this scenario where there's a lot of records and it's hard to know how many without fetching them, yeah, you need to resort to a pagination UI pattern that doesn't show the number of total records, right? And so it's a solution where you can actually get all the IDs with list objects and then filter all on your side. Yeah, you can know the number of records, right? But if you cannot use that solution, it is hard. Yeah, Tyler, sorry.
Yeah, I was wondering if it would be better, like if there was the option to be able to do a list objects call, but not at the high level object, but do it at like lower level objects, essentially filtering in specific objects in list objects. Would that be beneficial?
Can you elaborate? Hi, Tyler, sorry, I didn't get the idea.
Let me find a link really quick that explains it better.
Okay.
Basically, with contextual tuples, what Tyler's is saying, you could say do list objects, but only where the parent is, like if you're on a folder or a document where the parent is this. So instead of getting all documents, you're getting all documents within a folder. That would require but it's a possibility.
Yeah, I posted a discussion in OpenFGA on it, but it's basically that list objects at a lower part or a child of the hierarchy rather than the top level.
Yeah, and I'll add one more thing is like so long as you're not doing filtering. So maybe filtering by things like what I was mentioning, like within a folder maybe work, but not filtering based on name or something like this. If you're just doing the initial listing, not the full search, one thing for the total count you could do is run it in an async process separately and cache it. So when they first open the folder, you get it, but as they search through it, as they paginate, you don't run this constantly. It's cached. Like, yes, it might change in the meantime, but it's very unlikely. And are they gonna notice if it's 351 versus 352? Like within the minute. You could, like, it's not great, but it's also something. It won't block your first load. You can see in the UI, you can even put a loading on the total as you're calculating it and cache it for a small amount of.
I agree. I will only do that if it's so critical to show the count, right? Because it looks like a lot of work, right? So, yeah.
Yeah, that was actually our other like thought was like we should just cache all this, but then we're like we are then duplicating what is in OpenFGA, so like that doesn't seem like the best solution.
Yeah. Awesome. Great conversation. So thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
And then now, so we had Jeremy last month presenting what they are doing in Headspace. The recording is already in our channel. So they are in that channel, OpenFGA YouTube. There are all the community meetings, and there are also a lot of community presentations that happen in different events. They are in a playlist there if you want to learn about what's going on in the community from that perspective. Community news. So we were in KubeCon North America, and Tyler was there in the kiosk, and he presented a lightning talk. We also presented a talk with Dapper about design patterns for consistent centralized authorization, and that the recording is online is pretty cool. And I think it's one of the things we'll keep exploring to help customers to solve the dual right problems, how we can better integrate with products or libraries that help in that regard. And yesterday we were in OpenFGA, the CNCF. What is the call? Is Cube Days? CNC, what is the name of the event?
Just CNCF Toronto.
Okay, good. And so Ragged and Jacob were presenting there. And we also got approved a presentation for KubeCon Europe. And we're going to present with a team from T-Trade on how to use Envoy and OpenFGA together. And we have some ideas. Now we should need to make the presentation work. And it's going to be fun. And that's it. So the roadmap, no much changes. We are mostly working on keep improving list objects. We are very close to have. We are investing in production some enhancements that have improved CPU consumption and performance a lot. We are close to being able to ship them in OpenFGA and enable for everyone. And together with that, we are leaning towards using more the stream list objects API instead of the list objects one, and it can go faster and it's more flexible, so you can keep getting records. So there's not with the standard list objects endpoint, there's a limit that you can set in configuration, but there's a limit. This one is more 3 seconds, which if it takes more than 3 seconds, it's still not useful. So we just can get everything you can in a reasonable amount of time, and I think that will be probably a better way to use the endpoint. So we are adding it to the SDK, so there it's easier to use.
Sorry, one thing I would like to point out that Tyler specifically is looking for feedback. So if anyone is using the stream list objects endpoint, please reach out. We want to evolve, obviously both, but the more we hear from you about how you're using it and any value you're getting from the better we can do.
Yeah.
Most definitely.
Awesome. Okay, so thank you very much. And as usual, we get a lot of value from the community supporting the project, right? Even if starting the project, if you hadn't, I assume everyone here already did that. And if you have a use case in production, it's awesome that you added to our adopters MD list. And so we can brag about it and invite you to these meetings and present what you're doing. And so before wrapping up, anyone has more questions about anything regarding FGA that we can help in the last few minutes?
I do. When will Matthew be back?
I don't know. I see him often. I'm seeing often in the meeting. So he's trying to say us something. I don't know what exactly, but
I'm here to hang out and just soak up some good information. Thanks for the chats.
awesome. Okay, everyone. Thank you very much. Happy New Year, happy holidays, and see you in 2026.
George has a question.
Sorry. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I just want to ask kind of an interesting question I was thinking of recently is, do you guys have any kind of resources on sort of the UX design part of managing relationship-based access control? It's not something, that I've really encountered much just on the wild. There's a lot of publications from like NIST and stuff on regarding RBAC and ABAC, but not really enough for REBAC. So really interested to kind of hear people's thoughts on that.
That's a good lot, and we do have everything we have actually has been in the old Discord channel, maybe a bit around CNCF, but nothing in terms of the documentation or resource.
I have a question there because I can understand your question in a couple of ways. So it's more like, for example, this thing we mentioned about how you handle pagination in the UI side, right? For these scenarios, or it's more about if you want to build a generic UI to manage reback permissions. So what are you talking mostly about?
I guess probably the latter. I think
Okay.
right now we're kind of working with sort of design people that are trying to come up with management systems to show this kind of stuff. And it's like, you can always implement some kind of role-based thing because you can treat certain relations as roles, but maybe something more generic or general that's applicable to reback would be very welcome for them, I think.
Let me show. I'm looking in the account. There's a project that I've been trying to get presented here for a while, which is the Canonical team. They had a project called, what is it? If I find it. They have this this project, which in theory is like a UI to manage permissions in the Canonical platform or Reback. But and I've been trying to get them to present it, but they say they always almost there is it's not ready yet, and I stopped asking, but maybe now it's ready to present. So I'll try to get him and get them on board and see if they can show what they're trying to do. You can also try running this and see what it does. It's better doesn't have a screenshot to help you understand what they're trying to accomplish, but that's their goal, to build a generic UI that can help in these scenarios. And then the other perspective is in Reback, there's always a part of the UI which is about roles, right? So adding user to roles, and that is similar to how you handle Reback UIs, right? And then there's another part which is how you manage relations between resources and those roles or groups. And that can be more similar to the shared dialogue in Google Docs, right? So you have a resource and somehow you assign it to a group of people or to a specific users, right? And I think having documentation about those use cases it's interesting and it's something we can do. And there are more things. For example, something that a common question is you have a list of records, and then in each record you can perform certain actions. Right? I can edit, view it depending on the permissions I have in that record. How do I handle that? Right? Because now calling BatchCheck for each line to get all the permissions and displayed, that is probably too expensive, right? So what we've seen is, okay, you have the list and then you click a button and then you see the options, right? And then you edit. And so you can call list relations or BatchCheck whenever you select the option and not like every time for every day. So there are some things that we've been sharing and discussing that I think it might be worth documenting and getting more feedback.
Yeah, thanks for that.
Awesome. Thank you everyone again, and see you soon.